Hello, the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has sacked the chairman of his Conservative Party, Nadhim Zahawi. His dismissal comes after an independent investigation of Mr Zahawi's tax affairs. Now, these have been the subject of a growing controversy recently since it emerged that he had to pay a penalty to the tax authorities. The Prime Minister said the investigation made clear that, quote, there has been a serious breach of the ministerial code. Mr Sunak received the report from Sir Laurie Magnus, the independent advisor on ministers' interests, early this morning. Sir Laurie told the Prime Minister that certain omissions by Mr Zahawi fell short of the standards that ministers are expected to abide by, and he concluded, I consider that these omissions constitute a serious failure to meet the standards set out in the ministerial code. I consider that Mr Zahawi, in holding the high privilege of being a Minister of the Crown, has shown insufficient regard for the general principles of the ministerial code and the requirements in particular under the 7 principles of public life to be honest, open and an exemplary leader through his own behaviour. Well, in response to that, Mr Zahawi has put out his own statement. In a letter to the Prime Minister, he writes, "It has been the privilege of my life to serve in successive governments and to make a tangible difference to the country." He then went on to criticise press coverage of his position, saying, quote, "In a week when an MP was physically assaulted, I fail to see how one headline on this issue, 'The Noose Tightens,' reflects legitimate scrutiny of public officials." Well, finally, he assures the Prime Minister of his support from the backbenches in the coming years. Our political correspondent, David Wallace-Lockhart, has been giving me an update on this morning's breaking news.
We didn't know when this was going to come, but this morning we got the report from Sir Laurie Magnus, the Prime Minister's ethics advisor, who'd been investigating Nadhim Zahawi. And after his findings, we also got that letter from the Prime Minister, which he'd sent to Nadhim Zahawi, telling him he was sacked from government. Now, if we go through both of them, first of all, Sir Laurie Magnus, he goes into a lot of details in his findings, and it is quite critical of how Nadhim Zahawi has conducted himself in all of this. Now, he says that Nadhim Zahawi first started having talks with HMRC in April 2021. Mr Zahawi told Laurie Magnus that he formed the impression that this was just questions coming from HMRC. Laurie Magnus says he should have understood at the outset that he was under investigation. He talks about the fact that therefore this didn't come up in his declaration of interest, even when he became Chancellor, the Minister responsible for the tax and spend system, on the 5th of July 2022. Laurie Magnus critical of that, and he says that failing to declare that ongoing investigation before later in July 22 was a breach of that ministerial code. He also talks about the fact that we know now Nadhim Zahawi paid a penalty as part of his settlement with HMRC. Laurie Magnus again saying failing to update his declaration of interest form appropriately once that penalty had been paid was not correct, not disclosing the right information. And he says, sort of taken together, these omissions constitute, in Laurie Magnus's words, a serious failure to meet the standards set out in the ministerial code. Also, Laurie Magnus goes into the detail of an interview Nadhim Zahawi gave where he said that it was smears to say that HMRC were looking into him. Laurie Magnus says this wasn't as open and transparent as a government minister is supposed to be. This report went to the Prime Minister, and it looks like the Prime Minister took quite swift action on this. He wrote in this letter to Nadhim Zahawi that there's been a serious breach of the ministerial code. As a result, I've informed you of my decision to remove you from your position in His Majesty's government. Now, this was all going on moments before Michael Gove, the government minister who was out on the airwaves this morning talking on behalf of the government, was on the Laura Kuenssberg programme, so he had to immediately respond to this. Here's what he had to say.
When facts emerged about the position in which Nadhim found himself, the Prime Minister said we need an independent investigation. Sir Laurie Magnus, who, as you pointed out, is the independent advisor on ministerial standards, on ethics, was asked to look rapidly at the situation. He concluded his report. He wrote to the Prime Minister, I think, early today. And then the Prime Minister, immediately upon receipt of the letter, decided that Nadhim could no longer stay in the Cabinet.
But why 7 days ago did Nadhim Zahawi and Rishi Sunak appear to think that it was OK for somebody who had paid a penalty to the taxman while being the boss of the taxman to stay in post. Because I think to many of our viewers last week, that seemed absolutely blatantly like something that wasn't sustainable.
Well, as ever, it's always important to make sure that all the facts are investigated fully and properly. And that is why Sir Laurie Magnus was given the opportunity to do so, why he's concluded as he did, and why the Prime Minister has acted as he did. As a general rule, I think it is important when allegations are raised that they're investigated promptly, but also we shouldn't rush to judgment before there's been that investigation. And again, the specific issues of an individual's tax affairs are ones that require, in circumstances like this, a cool forensic analysis, and that is what Sir Laurie provided.
So that was Michael Gove talking to Laura Koonsberg. David, pretty much straight after that, we got Labour's reaction to all of this. What did they have to say?
Well, the line we're hearing from many people who are critical of how Rishi Sunak's handled this was that there were grounds to sack Nadhim Zahawi before he even asked his ethics advisor to look into all of this. And we heard that put to Michael Gove there. The fact that we knew that when he was Chancellor, he'd paid a penalty to HMRC. There were also questions circulating about how much Rishi Sunak knew and when, and perhaps he was put into the bear pit of Prime Minister's questions without quite knowing the full picture here, which would be grounds in a normal situation to be very unpleased one of your ministers had let you do that. That was along the lines of what we heard Labour saying this morning. It was Bridget Phillipson who was on the Laura Koonsberg programme for them.
This should have happened weeks ago. It was always going to end this way, and I think it speaks to Rishi Sunak's weakness that it's taken so very long for it to happen. And this isn't just about one individual. This is about right at the heart of government, a government that is just mired in sleaze. We've had Nadhim Zahawi, Suella Braverman, who herself also broke the ministerial code and then appointed as Home Secretary, Dominic Raab, Gavin Williamson. I think this speaks to a government that just is focused on the Conservative Party, not on the interests of the public. And this is going to continue to happen. This really isn't going away. And I think there are still serious questions that the Prime Minister needs to ask about all of this. Nadhim Zahawi has spent weeks seeking to dodge questions and to threaten those who asked him questions about his tax affairs.
So that was Labour's response to all of this. David, where does this leave the premiership of Rishi Sunak? Because, of course, when he first came in, he stood famously outside the door of Number 10 and said his government was going to be all about professionalism and integrity and standards.
Yes, and Rishi Sunak in many ways pitched himself as the candidate who could move on from the scandals that had surrounded his previous two successors and their times in government. Now, we've had Gavin Williamson, one of Rishi Sunak's ministers, who had to stand down over allegations about texts he'd sent a former chief whip. We've had Dominic Raab, the current Deputy Prime Minister, who's facing a probe about allegations of bullying. It should be said he denies those allegations. And now we've got the Conservative Party chair who's had to be sacked for breaching the ministerial code. All at a time when Michael Gove this morning wanted to talk about cladding, when the government tomorrow wants to talk about its plans for the NHS. The political oxygen is being sucked into stories about Conservative Party ministers and whether or not their behaviour's been appropriate. And when you're a Prime Minister not that far away from an election and lagging behind in the polls, this is not the sort of stories you want to be discussing at a point when you need to show the country you have plans for the problems it's facing.